I never believed the stories. The ones about the old house on the corner of Maple and Fifth. Every town has one of those places. An abandoned relic where kids dare each other to go and where rumors swirl like dead leaves in the wind. But when my best friend, Rachel, dragged me into her plan to spend the night there, I felt that gnawing unease that starts in your gut and creeps up your spine. Rachel was relentless. "Come on," she said, her eyes glinting in the dim light of the coffee shop where we'd been huddled on a rainy October evening. "It's just a house." There's something in her tone that still haunts me. A forced nonchalance, like she needed me to say yes because she was too scared to go alone. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The house was a hulking shadow, crouched at the end of the street like it was waiting for us. Its windows were black holes, and the gnarled oak tree in the yard clawed at the sky. The stories about the place weren't anything special, just whispers about a man who went mad and vanished, leaving the house to rot. But standing in front of it, the air felt heavy, like the atmosphere itself didn't want us there. "Let's get this over with," I muttered, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been, even for late October. The floorboards groaned under our weight, and the smell of mildew was suffocating. Rachel's flashlight swept over peeling wallpaper, a toppled chair, and a shattered mirror that caught the beam and threw jagged light across the room. We set up camp in what must have once been the living room. 2 sleeping bags, a lantern, and a couple of sandwiches we both knew we wouldn't eat. The plan was simple. Stay until dawn. No backing out. Easy, right? The first few hours were uneventful. We told stupid jokes to break the tension and took turns making exaggerated ghostly wails. But then, as the clock crept closer to midnight, the house started to feel different. It started with the whispers. First, I thought it was the wind, the faint sound of something moving through the cracks in the walls. But the longer I listened, the more distinct it became, soft, murmuring voices, too low to make out. Rachel heard them too. I could tell by the way her eyes darted around the room. "Probably just the pipes," she said, her voice trembling. "Old houses make weird noises." I nodded, but my stomach churned. Pipes don't sound like words. Around 1 a.m., Rachel decided to explore. She said it was to prove there's nothing to be scared of, but I think she just needed an excuse to move, to stop sitting there with the whispers pressing in on us. I didn't want her to go alone, so I followed her down a narrow hallway that led to the back of the house. The air grew colder as we walked, our footsteps muffled by a thick layer of dust. At the end of the hallway was a door, painted black and slightly ajar. Rachel hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "Maybe we shouldn't," I started, but she pushed it open before I could finish. The room beyond was small and empty, except for a single wooden chair in the center. And on the chair sat a music box. Rachel stepped closer, her flashlight bouncing off the tarnished metal. "Who leaves something like this behind?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I was too busy staring at the dust around the chair, undisturbed, like no one had been in the room for years. Rachel reached out to touch the music box, but the moment her fingers brushed it, the whispers surged, louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, circling us like an invisible tide. "Let's go," I said, grabbing her arm, but she didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the music box, wide and glassy. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Hear what?" I asked, panicking now. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached out and wound the music box. The melody was delicate, almost soothing, if not for the fact that the whispers rose in pitch, twisting into something shrill and frantic. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows on the walls writhing like they were alive. I yanked Rachel back, and the music box toppled to the floor, the ballerina snapping off with a sharp crack. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was almost worse. Then, from somewhere deep in the house, we heard a door creak open. The sound echoed, low and resonant, and my flashlight flickered. Rachel finally moved, grabbing my hand as we bolted back down the hallway. But the house didn't want us to leave. The air felt thicker with every step, like we were running through water. The walls seemed to close in, the hallway narrowing until I had to turn sideways to keep moving. Behind us, the whispers swelled, overlapping into a chaotic hum that made my head pound. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw something. A figure, pale and blurred, standing just at the edge of the beam. We stumbled into the living room, our makeshift campsite a mess of scattered belongings. The lantern we'd left on had gone out, plunging the room into darkness. I couldn't tell if the shadows that moved around us were real or just tricks of my panicked mind. Rachel yanked me toward the front door, but when we reached it, it wouldn't budge. She twisted the handle frantically, throwing her weight against the wood, but it didn't give an inch. It wasn't locked. It felt like the house itself was holding it shut. "Help me," she gasped, her voice rising in desperation. I joined her, pushing and pulling with everything I had, but it was useless. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't words exactly, but they carried an urgency, a command that I couldn't ignore. And then the music started. It was the same melody from the music box, soft and lilting, but now it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound curled around us, sinking into my skin, and with it came a smell, something sweet and rotten, like flowers left to decay. "Emma?" Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. She was staring past me, her face pale and frozen in terror. I turned slowly, and my flashlight flickered one last time. In the darkness, I saw them, not clearly but enough. Shapes, humanoid but wrong, their outlines shifting like smoke. Eyes glinted in the shadows, too many to count, all fixed on us. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, heavy and absolute. And then a voice, deep and resonant, filled the room. "Stay." It wasn't a command. It was a promise. Rachel screamed, and the sound broke whatever spell had rooted me in place. I grabbed the lantern from the floor and smashed it against the wall. The glass shattered, and flames licked up the peeling wallpaper. The fire spread faster than it should have, illuminating the room in an eerie, flickering light. The figures recoiled, their edges dissolving into the shadows. The house groaned, a deep, shuddering sound that vibrated through my chest. Rachel and I threw ourselves at the door one last time, and this time it gave way. We tumbled out onto the porch, the cold night air slamming into us like a wave. Behind us, the fire roared, but when I looked back, the house was untouched. No flames, no smoke, just darkness and that terrible, empty window. For a moment, we just stood there, gasping for air, our breath forming clouds in the chill. The street was silent, the world outside seemingly untouched by the nightmare inside that house. Rachel's hand was clamped around my wrist, her nails biting into my skin, but I didn't pull away. I needed the contact to remind myself we'd made it out. I swear it was on fire, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Rachel didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the house, wide and unblinking, like she was expecting something or someone to follow us out. I wanted to tell her to stop looking, to just turn away and run, but I couldn't bring myself to move either. Then the whispers started again, faint at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. They seemed to seep out from the cracks in the wood, from the very foundation of the house. I realized they weren't coming from inside anymore. They were outside, surrounding us, "We need to go," I said, tugging at Rachel's arm. She didn't budge. "Do you hear it?" "Of course I hear it." "No," she turned to me, her face pale and drawn, her eyes glittering with something I couldn't place. "It's louder now." I opened my mouth to argue, but then I heard it too. The whispers weren't just louder, they were clearer. The nonsensical hum of voices had started to form something tangible, something that sounded like word. Rachel's voice was a thin thread. "They're saying our names." My stomach turned to ice. I strained to listen, and there it was, soft, drawn out and haunting. My name, stretched and warped, whispered in 100 different voices. And Rachel's, too, twisted into the same eerie melody. The sound seemed to grow closer, pressing against us like an invisible tide. My instincts screamed at me to run, but Rachel was frozen, rooted to the spot as if the whispers had wrapped around her ankles and were pulling her back toward the house. I grabbed her shoulders, shaking her hard. "Rachel!" Her gaze flickered to mine, and for a moment, she looked like she was waking up. Then her expression shifted, fear melting into something softer, almost serene. She turned back toward the house, her lips parting like she was about to speak. And that's when I saw it. The shadows inside the window moved again, but this time, they didn't retreat. They surged forward, coalescing into a shape. A figure, pale and indistinct, stepping closer to the glass. It wasn't human. The proportions were all wrong, its limbs too long and its head tilted at an impossible angle. But its eyes were too familiar. They were Rachel's. "No," I gasped, pulling her back with all my strength. "You're not going back in there." Her body resisted, rigid as stone. "It's calling me," she whispered, her voice dreamlike. I did hear it. The whispers were sharper now, more insistent, threading through my mind like tendrils. But I fought against them, focusing on the weight of Rachel in my hands, the scrape of the porch beneath my feet. I couldn't lose her, not to this. With a final, desperate effort, I yanked her away from the house. She stumbled, blinking like someone waking from a trance, and then the connection broke. The whispers faltered, fading into the night, and the figure in the window dissolved back into the shadows. We didn't stop running until we reached the end of the street. Only then did we collapse onto the curb, shaking and gasping for breath. The house loomed in the distance, dark and silent once more, but I could still feel it watching us. Rachel refused to talk about what happened after that night. She avoided me at school, her cheerful demeanor replaced by a quiet, haunted stillness. I tried to reach out, but she wouldn't answer my calls or texts. Within a week, her parents packed up and moved away without explanation. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I moved on, forgot the house, and lived my life. But that would be a lie, because the whispers didn't stop. They followed me home, slipping into the corners of my room, murmuring just on the edge of hearing. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were telling me to come back. First, I tried to ignore it. I buried myself in schoolwork, blasted music to drown out the whispers, and left the lights on all night to keep the shadows at bay. But the house, or whatever was tied to it, was patient. The whispers crept into the quiet moments, like when I was brushing my teeth or lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. Even in crowded places, I would catch snippets of my name, spoken in that low, chilling cadence, like it was coming from just over my shoulder. I started seeing things. It began with the reflection in the bathroom mirror. At first, it was subtle, my reflection lingering a half-second too long after I moved, or shadows flickering behind me where there shouldn't be any. Then one night, as I leaned in to splash water on my face, I glanced up and froze. My reflection wasn't copying me. It was staring at me, its head tilted slowly, unnaturally to the side, just like the figure in the window. I screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a glass of water. When I looked again, the reflection was normal, my wide-eyed, terrified face staring back. But I knew what I'd seen. The nightmares came next. Every night, I was back in the house, running through its endless hallways. The doors slammed shut behind me, trapping me deeper and deeper inside, while the whispers grew deafening, echoing from every direction. Sometimes, I'd catch glimpses of Rachel ahead of me, her back turned, her silhouette blurry and wrong. I call out to her, but she wouldn't turn around. When I reached her, she'd slowly turn her head, her eyes empty and hollow. Then I'd wake up, gasping for air, the whispers still faint in my ears. It all came to a head 3 weeks after we left the house. I was walking home from school, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the sidewalk. My headphones were in, the volume cranked up, but the whispers found their way through. Louder now, more urgent. "Come back," they said. "We're waiting." I yanked the headphones out, my heart pounding. Ahead of me, I saw someone standing at the corner of the street, their back to me. They were wearing a familiar jacket, Rachel's jacket. My stomach twisted. "Rachel!" I called out. The figure didn't move. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and run. But something stronger, curiosity, fear, or maybe the same force that had been haunting me since that night, pulled me forward. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. When I was just a few feet away, the figure turned. It wasn't Rachel. It was me, or at least it looked like me. A perfect copy, down to the freckles on my nose and the strands of hair escaping my ponytail. But the eyes, they were wrong. They were dark, empty voids, and they stared at me with an intensity that froze me in place. "You left us," it said, its voice a distorted echo of my own. "You have to come back." I stumbled backward, my breath hitching in my chest. "No," I whispered. "I'm not going back." The figure smiled, and it was the most chilling thing I'd ever seen. "You don't have a choice." The next thing I knew, I was running. My feet pounded against the pavement as I sprinted down the street, not daring to look back. The whispers were everywhere now, louder and more insistent, swirling around me like a storm. By the time I reached my house and slammed the door behind me, I was shaking so hard I could barely lock it. But I wasn't safe. Not really. That night, the dreams were worse. I wasn't running through the house anymore. I was in that small room with the music box, the walls pressing closer and closer. The whispers had become screams, and the shadows writhed like living things, reaching for me. When I woke up, my window was open. The air was freezing, and the faint sound of the music box melody drifted in from somewhere outside. I still live like this. Every day feels like I'm balancing on the edge of a knife, teetering between normalcy and something far darker. The whispers never fully leave. They linger at the back of my mind, soft and persistent, like a radio playing just out of tune. Sometimes they're louder on quiet nights or when I'm alone for too long. Other times they're barely there, a subtle tug that I can almost convince myself isn't real. Almost. But my willpower has become my anchor. No matter how strong the pull, no matter how many nights I wake drenched in cold sweat, I won't go back to that house. I can't. It's like there's a line drawn deep inside me, a primal instinct that knows returning would mean something far worse than the whispers, something final,